Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is a senior editor at Boom Studios on comics like Wild's End, Lumberjanes, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, and more. It's Dafna Pleban. Thanks for coming on, Dafna.
Hi, thank you for having me. Your radio voice is so great, by the way. That was wild.
Yeah. It's like the one time in my entire podcast that I'm actually like semi-professional.
It sounds like the morphin sequence. Like it was like the verbal version of a morphin sequence in Power Rangers. It's like you were one person and now you're a superhero.
Exactly. Well, man, that's fantastic. I need to embrace that. If only I could do that all the time, as opposed to somehow turning the word I into like a 10 consonant word, which is what I normally do.
Hey, it's called special effects in comics. It's allowed.
Exactly. So on today's episode, we're going to talk about your role as an editor and your position as perhaps the most enthusiastic lover of things in the entirety of Twitter, which I really appreciate. But we're going to start by going all the way back, as I'm curious as to how you ended up at Boom. Let's start at the beginning. From what I understand, it was like some combination of Star Trek and Assorted Robins who were your gateways into comics. What was your comic book origin story as a reader?
Gosh, I mean, it's such a good question, right? Because I feel like I always have a different answer and all of them are true. So I guess it's sort of like a Joker's origin story.
Totally.
Because every time, like, I remember when I hear that question, I remember another time I read comics and it's just a bit earlier than the last time I remember. I also have really terrible memory. So
I think we all do secretly. Like, that's one of the information overload, like, problems is the fact that we now remember nothing.
Yeah, because we have access to all of it in Google, so I can just search it rather than actually retain any information.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think I've always loved science fiction, in part because growing up, my parents spoke Hebrew at home. They really only let me watch PBS and Reading Rainbow because they heard reading is good, and they wanted me to both speak English well and, I guess, as all immigrant parents, they want their kid to be a doctor, and they're all like, well, PBS is smart. and Reading Rainbow had a crossover episode with Star Trek Next Generation. LeVar Burton showed how sort of like the special effects happened. I have such a vivid memory of him showing how the transporter effect worked, and it blew my mind. And I convinced them that Star Trek on Fox was on the same station as Reading Rainbow because it was the same actor. Mm-hmm. I was also a little, I was about to say a little shit, but you said I could curse. So I was a little shit as a kid. So I got really into Star Trek. And that was also the one thing that when I would go to Israel with my family was sort of a constant. There was always a Star Trek episode on somewhere in America or in Israel. And the other constant was there was always a Star Trek book in a bookstore. It could be in Barnes & Noble's. It could be in a secondhand shop. It could be in a secondhand shop in Israel. Mm-hmm. And before we were able to pack 1,000 books on our iPhones and bring it with us for a 17-hour flight, I would just pack my entire carry-on with those Star Trek pocketbooks. I just, I lived on a pure diet of Capri Suns and Star Trek pocketbooks. I discovered there were comic books, and I started reading the comic books, and the comic books brought me into the store, and I thought, I truly think, and maybe this is just revisionist history, because Tim Drake had the mock turtleneck cape, and I associated the mock turtleneck with Star Trek, the Next Generation costumes. I think, honestly, truly, I was that literal as a child and just, jumped to the next mock turtleneck I saw, which is Robin's. Comic shops are like a gateway drug. Mm-hmm. And so I would bug my parents to take me whenever they could get a chance. And then my mom started studying for law school while I was in third grade, and she would troop us over to Barnes and Noble's, me and my little brother, and let us run wild in the store. We were those, how you always read on employee complaint forums of this mom brings her kids and lets them run wild around the store. Mm-hmm. That was me. I was that child.
I was the kid who would actually sit in front of magazine stands and comic book stands in shops
and
read everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember there was there's a local grocery store in Alaska called Cars, and I remember the magazine section in one of them, which is where the comics were. It had this little edge on it for the comic or the magazines to stand up in, and I remember that was the exact size of my butt, and so I could actually fit in there and sit, and so I would sit there forever and read comics. It was fantastic. Anyways, continue.
You're very much a cat owner. If it fits, it sits, and you sat because you fit. But I was the same way. I just camped out in that, like the sci-fi section in Barnes and Nobles that had all the Star Trek books faced the comic section.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a very natural progression to picking up those trades. And then, like, I realized the comic store was right across the street. Now that I'm an adult and realize across the street was like a 6-lane boulevard,
Right.
probably me leaving without my mom knowing and crossing that street to go look at comics was, if I ever become a parent, is like terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought it was an adventure.
Oh, yeah.
And that's how I got my first comic store.
That's amazing. I do. I have to bring up the hyper literal nature of children really quick, just because I've never actually admitted this. I think basically to anybody besides my wife, because it's so stupid. But when I was like 11 and the Spice Girls just became a thing, for some reason in my head, Indigo Girls were the same thing, because Indigo was like, I thought Indigo was a spice, and I thought they just changed their name to Spice Girls, and so I thought they were the same thing. And I was like,
God.
Their sound is so different now. This is really confusing. And I remember, I think I told my wife that eventually. She's like, why would you think that? Indigo's not even a spice. And I'm like, I don't know. I was 11.
It sounds like a spice.
It sounds like it could be. I have no idea. Anyway, so yes, children are super literal.
I kind of like now I'm picturing like a competition between the Indigo Girls and the Spice Girls, like DC versus Marvel, and like wanting the amalgamation of the two.
The girl band extended universe.
Yes. Well, if you ever talk to Shannon Waters, we talk about our sort of like boy band AU idea of like all the boy bands are secret spies. It's a lot of fun.
I can
They're
see
both
that.
secret spies and lesbians.
That does kind of
So
sound
it's
like
a whole thing.
I could see that being like a Grayson type book. That would
Yeah.
that would totally work. I do want to say, like, I heard on another podcast you did that you grew up on, like, you know, Robin with his Starfleet costume and like varying 90s like DC books like Young Justice and the Nightwing book. Then I want to say that era was like a sneaky good time for like DC teen heroes, and like
Straight
that
up.
it's a really good time to grow up on. Like that was what I grew up on, and I was like obsessed with the Tim Drake Robin book and the Nightwing Dick Grayson book. That was both of those books were fantastic. So was Young Justice. I was in love. Like Impulse was my jam. I wanted my hair to look exactly like Impulse's. It does not.
Well, and Impulse was so. I remember that first 6-issue like arc that Wade did with Humberto, where it felt like this grounded, like the kids, unlike, you know, well, and I'm gonna set Robin aside for a second, but unlike a lot of like the teen programming aimed towards us at that age and at that time, like Impulse looked like the awkward, dumb, prepubescent like teens we were going to school with. Like real high school students have gigantic limbs and big heads for their bodies and are underdeveloped and are dorky and stupid and hyperactive. And yet it still had, I still remember when it was revealed that I think his friend's mother was abusive. And it still had that sort of emotional spine that even though these kids looked and talked and acted like us and were dorky and stupid and tripped over their feet like we did, they also experience like these really crunchy, uncomfortable emotional experiences that, you know, when you're that age, you don't have context for. You think it's just happening to you, or you think it's just happening to your friend. And it was a very, like, I think that kind of book is hard to write. And I think that kind of book is hard to write in a shared universe. And it felt effortless in Impulse. I totally with you on the Impulse thing. Loved it.
Yeah, it was weird because it felt real, but it also like kind of felt like it revealed like a different part of being like a teenager that doesn't understand what life is quite yet. Like it revealed like what that world could be like even as I was living in it, and it was really fascinating. Also, it is kind of funny because we had talked about how like, you know, we engage with all this information and like we kind of like forget our memories. Bart was kind of like his future was just basically him like being fed information all the time. He could have come from our world. We don't even know.
Yeah, that's pretty prescient. Yeah, that's so true.
So I know you eventually worked at a comic shop, right? Like that wasn't it wasn't the one across the street from Barnes and Noble, I'm guessing.
No, I worked at the comic shop. I went to school at UCLA, and there was a Jay and Son Bob Secret stash in Westwood at the time, and I was, you know, already giving them most of my money, and I heard it's such a shallow reason to get a job, and I heard you get an employee discount. And so I applied to be an employee because I was crazy. I was already working 2 jobs. This was like a third job that I truly didn't have time for, and my classes reflected as such. Uh, but I loved it. I loved being able. I think what I loved most about working in a comic shop was having that little rec shelf
Mm-hmm.
where you can kind of like, and you probably experienced on my Twitter, if I really like something, I won't shut up about it. And imagine if I'm like taking people's money. It's a really toxic combination.
Mm-hmm.
But putting together that like rec shelf and the thing that I loved at the time and wrecking it to people was just a blast. And I really loved actually part of working in a comic shop is I really took to heart the pre-ordering system,
Mm-hmm.
which, I think has positives and negatives, especially now. But I love sort of doing the, if you like this, then you'll like this kind of
Yeah.
comparative analysis. And I would always like, if Alias was your favorite TV show, there's a comic called Alias. Like I said, still very literal, well into my 20s. But I like putting together that sort of like comic playlist. And so I really wanted to bring new readers into the medium.
Mm-hmm.
And the comic shop was a great experience for that.
Yeah, and I feel like, I've always kind of had a person at my shop up here in Anchorage. It's Bosco's Comics, and like there's always been like one person who's been my main person. And they used to have like a rec shelf, and it was it was just kind of above the register, and you look up and it would be a rec with the person's name. And it was funny because like these people became like I didn't necessarily know them, but I was always like, oh, this person, I totally love their taste. I'm gonna buy whatever they recommend because I always love it. It's really helpful because it ties into my wife is not into comics. We went to go to Bosco's together, and she walked in with me and she was like, how do you know what to buy? And that's like such a legit question to ask. And like those rec shelves and the read if you like it's like a really great gateway for people who have to ask that question. I always love that stuff.
Well, and I liked it because, like you said, you start to understand or you start to develop this person has tastes that line up with my own.
Right.
So if they're going to recommend something I haven't heard of, there's an 80% chance that our tastes will align. And it's funny, I do think comic shops have been doing an analog what now digitally we experience with something like Twitter and we experience with Facebook, where it shows you the tweets your friends are liking.
Mm-hmm.
And more often than not, they kind of do align with your own taste, which
Right.
can sometimes be terrifying. You're like, oh, I share this feel. Oh, no. I'm not a unique flower in the universe. It usually has to do with Captain America's abs. But it's interesting to see sort of like that behavior is something comic shops has done so well. The one downside was I've been reading comics since I was in second grade. I've been, I covered comics for my school newspaper, and I've been writing about comics online, and I've been an active, cheerleader for it. And I would be working behind the counter, and I would still get that sort of like, competency check from randos, from people who like don't know shit.
Like you have to be quizzed before you can be.
Exactly, and even as an editor, even as someone who arguably, for good or for ill, is a gatekeeper, I still get that sometimes, competency check. And so comic shops, if you're not a person who kind of has this, I think some people are lucky to have this sort of built-in obliviousness, and I do have a degree of obliviousness. I don't know, like a bad experience has happened until probably like 48 hours later. I was like, oh, that was fucked up.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of lets me skate through some, shady stuff, probably more easier than others. Like comic shops can be really intimidating, really uncomfortable, and unwelcoming. It was also a place that I loved. And it is really kind of cool now. I do think the comic shop experience has changed. I think it's more boutique. I think it's more aimed at the enthusiast. And I think the enthusiast isn't just guys anymore.
Yeah.
And that's really exciting. And it's exciting to be a part of that, in real time.
Yeah, and I think that, and we're going to get into this, but one of the things I think is interesting about your background is the fact that you worked at a comic shop and you actually came into Boom as a marketing assistant, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I imagine those things kind of affect, I don't know how much they affect, like, your day-to-day editorial life, but maybe they affect your perspective on things and your approach on what does or doesn't work in comics and what you would like to see more of. And I think that's really cool because now you can do the read if you like, but you actually get to cast these books and try to make them real.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting in the sense that I came in as marketing, but I never felt I was I had the skill for it in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
I could be incredibly enthusiastic and active about something I was excited about, right? But
Right.
if something that I felt neutral or not about, it was much harder to sort of generate that energy and fake it. And so I do I did like the opportunity editorial provided where it was, I got to apply my taste in real time.
Mm-hmm.
That if something didn't work, it's the result of a choice that I had a hand in. And so I, halfway through the year, I kind of like turned to Chip Mosher, who hired me, and was just incredibly like encouraging and like, really saw that enthusiasm in me and nurtured it. And I was like, I don't have it in me, man. Like I want to talk about the thing that I love about the comic. I don't want to sell the comic to someone who doesn't want to read it.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Totally.
And I had to, when I came to Boom, I did ask, like, can I be an editorial assistant as well? And I was simultaneously working for Matt Gagnon, who was the managing editor at the time. And poor Matt, was given this assistant who didn't know grammar, didn't know spelling, didn't know anything. And he's like trying to, run this entire line of comics and like had to simultaneously teach me how to be an assistant, how to be effective as an editor, and be helpful while I'm also splitting time with trying to help the one person doing marketing at the nascent era of Boom. And so it was a pretty hectic first year. And at the end of the first year, I was like, hey, I think I just want to do editorial.
Mm-hmm.
And to Chip's credit, he's like, you really love it and you're really good at that. And I think we can make that happen. And so I became an assistant editor after that. And, and I've been here ever since. And so I really I think that's something that I really appreciate about where I work is if you are excited about something, they don't say, well, we hired you because of X. You don't get to do that. And there are a lot of people at this company who had similar trajectories of, starting off in marketing and coming to editorial, or starting off in operations and going to design. It's very much a environment that prizes enthusiasm and over kind of like paper skills, if that makes any sense.
Totally. I mean, it's hard to do a good job if you don't enjoy the things you're working on, and it's hard to fake enthusiasm. And so that makes total sense. But I want to go back because I in my research I discovered that fittingly in at least or somewhat your job at Boom came because you had your own podcast. Mm-hmm. So did you have designs on working in comics, or is this just like kind of how things worked out?
It's a big scam. It's a big con. What happened was I, in college in like sophomore year, I went to Comic-Con for the first time. Me and my best friend Jen, who I'm still friends with, and my little brother who was in high school at the time. We road trip to Comic-Con. I slept, in my car. I slept at UCSD with a friend at their dorm. Did that whole sort of broke student experience, and this sounds terrible. I absolutely hated it. I'm just not built to sleep in my car. Discovered that. And I also saw the people with the press passes getting in for free. Mm-hmm. And I said, next year, I'm going to, this will feel better if I didn't pay out the nose for a ticket to have a bad time. If I got the ticket for free, the rest I can stand.
Right.
Also, it seems like they get to go to these special panels just for the press. Mm-hmm. And that's way better than waiting in line. I'm going to be press. And I convinced my school newspaper to cover Comic-Con, and comics in particular. So it started with give me a comics column. I'll write about new releases. And then build up my byline that way. And, the scam worked because now I had a byline and I could apply for a press pass, and I got UCLA to send us to Comic-Con, and I had the best Comic-Con of my life. It was amazing. I was like, Oh my God, I've got a press pass. This sounds terrible, but our photographer broke both of his legs.
Oh
So
my God.
he had a wheelchair pass. We had great seats. It was awful. It was like such a early 20s selfish experience, but it worked.
Yeah.
I got rewarded for my deviousness. And then I graduated college and had that sort of like, well, I can't write for the school newspaper anymore. What am I going to do? And I was working at the computer lab. I was the sort of classroom technical consultant. I showed the teachers how to use software in their courses. I taught Photoshop classes. I taught myself graphic design kind of in that interim and was doing a lot of that. And so I had a print background. And I realized that, well, writing is work. Writing is a lot of work. And I don't want to do work. I just want to go to Comic-Con. You know what's easy? And I know this is wrong, and I know you're experiencing this right now, David.
This is legit. I know what you're going to say, and I agree with it. Continue.
I was like, you know what's easy? Just talking about something that I love. and they give you those free business cards like online, like if you just have a URL. And so I'll just record like 2 or 3 episodes with my friends at the comic store, because I was still working at the comic store, about new releases. And then I'll get a URL for $5 and I'll apply for a free business card. And then I'll send that URL and that sort of like 2 episode backlog of this comic podcast. Mm-hmm. And I'll get a press pass that way. And it worked.
My God. What year was this?
I don't know off the top of my head. I think it was 2007.
Okay.
I think it was 2007. And it worked. And I just kept doing the podcast because it was in my head easy. And it wasn't easy. I learned how to edit. I learned how to do CSS. I learned, a CMS to put it on a blog. I had to teach myself all these things to pull off the scam. And it's sort of like the classic bank heist of, how we can get the bank to give us money? Get a job at the bank. Like, you're just doing it. You're not ripping anyone off. You just taught yourself a skill and you applied yourself. But in my head, I thought it's more fun if it's a crime. And then that's how I got on the radar of Boom, because Boom was doing sort of release parties at Meltdown at the time. And I went to it and I met up with Chip and I was like, hey, I'd love to interview some writers, really help make my podcast seem legitimate. And Chip stayed in contact. And I was working at Entertainment Weekly. Eventually I ended up at Entertainment Weekly as an editorial intern. Mm-hmm. And got to go to Comic-Con with them, which was just an amazing, insane experience. And that sort of made me look, I guess, legitimate enough to bring me on. I was like, little did they know they were stuck with me for 10 years.
I do want to say really quick, I take no offense to the fact that podcasts are way easier than writing. There's a reason why I write a lot less than I do now, or than I used to, and I podcast a lot more. It is easier, and it's like, it's still work. It's still work, yeah. But the thing is like, I mean, you were on the podcast like frontier early, and like you had to learn that stuff. Those are extremely valuable skills, like being able to do audio editing and do all that stuff and all the website stuff. Very valuable.
None of that. Just because you learned it, just because I learned it, God, 7, 8, 10, I don't know, 10 years ago. Oh Jesus, it was 10 years ago. Doesn't mean that stuff like carries, right?
Sure.
Like, you know what I mean? Like CMS, like all the code. I did code in Notepad and like did the HTML by hand, but now people don't use that. They use more complicated stuff. And I used Audacity, and then I stayed with Audacity even though I had access to GarageBand, just because you learn and you know the thing that you know, even if it's harder.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really transfer. And also, I'll be frank with you, man, my voice is annoying. I don't know how you can stand to listen to it. I could barely listen to myself talk. In my head, I'm so deep and worldly, and then I hear it, and it's like a chipmunk on acid. So the act of like actually editing the thing was nails on a chalkboard.
I actually used to really hate my voice, because in my head I have this like amazing baritone voice, and then I like listen to it editing and I'm just like, oh, this is terrible. But at this point I don't really care. I've gotten over it. I've done like 200 episodes almost, and I'm just like, that's good. You did way more though, I'm guessing.
No, I didn't. I can tell you exactly how many I did. I did 12.
You did 12?
I told you it wasn't. It was a scam. I don't think people understand. And then I did. Oh, I did do a podcast at Boom. I forgot. I did 50 minutes with Wade for I think it was like 10 episodes, and they were much longer than 15 minutes. When they said, I was like, just do 15 minutes. It's like, oh, honey, oh, I don't think you understand. 15 minutes is the intro. Are you kidding me?
That's just the part where we talk about the Indigo Girls and the Spice Girls.
Yeah, and then I pick a fight. It's an hour.
That's amazing. So let's get into the gig itself. So you're senior editor, right?
Yeah.
So senior editor at Boom Studios these days, working on titles like Lumberjanes, Fence, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, and My Precious Wild's End. What exactly does being a senior editor at Boom entail?
Patience. Good Lord, that's such a good question.
Well, I mean,
I
do
think
think
perseverance is definitely it. Like I stuck around. I'm still alive.
I mean, that's one of the things that I think editorial is one of like the weirdly, wildly misunderstood roles in comics, because I've joked about this many a time with editors who've come on my podcast, but it's like quite often, like most fans only know about editors when they're perceived to be ruining the readers' lives. Or like ruining the creators' lives in their mind or something like that. And it's like, obviously your life is a lot more than ruining people's lives, I would hope.
I mean, that's a part of it.
It's a very important part.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is, I think, passion. And I know that sounds really generic, but you have to be an advocate for the things you're excited about and the people you're excited about. And especially, for me, I live in Tumblr, and I live on DeviantArt, and I live on ArtStation, and I'm constantly just ingesting art that I love and writers and creators that I love. And I'm, reading comic books, and I'm reading books, and I'm watching TV, and I got into comics because I love serialized storytelling more than anything. I like the idea of characters living on past this sort of big moment in their lives and emotionally kind of experiencing the aftermath. And Big Two Comics was really a space for that at the time. It was, Tim Drake is going to go on after his mother dies, and who is he, and all these things. And so I don't know if his mother died, or was she just drugged. My memory is terrible.
I feel like she did die. Yeah, something bad happened, but that happens.
Something bad happened to a mom in DC Comics. Who knew?
Whoa!
Spoilers. So I think as an editor, you have to be excited about the medium itself and what it can do, as opposed to what prose can do, as opposed to what film can do. And comics in particular, I think gives you that sort of serialized opportunity, but also gives you time. You live with the characters in their biggest moments much longer than if they happen on the screen. You can sit and look at a page for as long as you want, but everything else is determined by how fast you read or by how fast it's edited. But in a comic, you can just look at something. There's this like liminal space in how information is presented in a comic that, when you read a sentence in prose, you've read the sentence. You can't stare at the sentence and appreciate its, serifs, In a comic, you can read it, but then you can also just look at it and experience it on that level. And I really loved that about comics. And so as an editor, if there's like a particular art style I love, if there's a particular writer voice that I love, at least where I'm at, I'm empowered to reach out to them and see if they're interested in working in this medium. And so a lot of what you do as an editor is bring voices together. There are cartoonists, there are people who can write and draw. But I also love that comics is collaboration. There's writers, there's artists, there's colorists, there's letterer, there's, you're seeing graphic design actually play a huge part in how comics are being presented and information is being communicated. I think Image has some of the best graphic design going on that feels part and parcel with the story being told. And so I love kind of, as an editor, you get to kind of be the garage that the band plays in and tries out new material and help them polish it and help it kind of sing in resonance. And so just as an editor, you're bringing kind of voices together that may not have found each other otherwise, and introducing someone to a creative partner that might become the person they love working with most of all. I think about, Go-Go Power Rangers and Ryan Parrott and Dan Mora, like in no other kind of industry where those two people meet and get to work together and be creative together, and they just sing. Same thing with Fence. C.S. Paquette and Johanna, they live on opposite ends of the world, and now I can kind of bring them together, and they get to explore this world together. I love that part about comics. I love introducing someone to a creative partner and watching them kind of sing the same note together. And so as a senior editor, I think you become kind of more and more sure about your choices. You're not going to make a perfect choice every time. But you do start to see something a little bit quicker in raw material. You can polish something, or if that person, does something works on something the next 2 years, they're going to be amazing. A great example, Daniele D'Inoculo, who is on Power Rangers right now, who's doing the Shattered Grid event for us. We've been talking to him for ages and been staying in contact with him. I think Alex Gaylor, who's now at DC, was the first person to talk to him. And we just sort of stayed in contact with him and saw his style develop. And I just think he's doing some of the best work on the stands right now. Dan Moore's also a great example of that. I don't know if you remember a couple of years back on Tumblr, and I think he just posted it. He was doing these sort of DC biker characters.
No, I don't remember that.
He just posted the Wonder Woman on his Instagram, but he had done like all these sort of these biker versions of DC characters, and they were just pinups. There were no sequential pages anywhere. And I was thirsty, man. I was like, who is this guy? This guy's amazing. And another thing as an editor, you get really good at finding email addresses. Artists, please provide email addresses if you want people to reach out to you, because I go to some creepy lengths to find email addresses of artists I'm excited about.
I want to say that's something you have to do as a podcaster too, because lots of outreach, lots and lots of outreach.
You get really good at being like, well, you opened a Blogspot 10 years ago and you put your email address there, and boy, I can guess that you moved from Yahoo to Gmail but kept the same username, so I'm just going to do a shot in the dark.
See what happens.
And he had a Behance, and I created a Behance account just for him and reached out to him on that because I couldn't find an email. And now we've been working with him ever since. So as a editor, I think like having kind of that eye for talent is something you develop over time, and it's usually cues to your taste. I love story editing. I think it's one of my favorite things, and part of this job that I love to do is like work with a writer and really kind of find the most exciting, emotional gut punch version of a story we're discussing. And it's just a great experience because it feeds kind of all parts of the soul, right? You get to look at some beautiful art, and you get to talk amazing story, and hopefully you can bring it together. And that's the other thing that I love about working in this industry and working in a collaborative environment. It's actually made me kind of less of a dick about other people's creative works.
Sure.
I remember being in college and having an opinion and being like, that sucks, and that's good, and that's perfect, and that's wonderful. And like, there's so many things that I've worked with creators and they think it's not their best work, or all they can see is the version that they didn't do, or it's not the perfect version in their head. And to the fans don't know that. They loved it. It hit them emotionally. They connected with a piece. And so I think it made me realize the things that I love is someone else's, it could have been better. And then the thing that I might not have responded to, someone tried their hardest, and maybe the ingredients just didn't set that time. Maybe the timeline didn't work. Maybe the schedule didn't work. Maybe they tried for something and it just didn't hit. And it's not through anyone not caring about the story or being bad at their job. It's just a variety of variables that sometimes crop up. Making a good thing is hard. Making a bad thing is hard. This job is hard. And I really have learned to appreciate the work people put into things, even if it doesn't work for me. And so that's, I guess, another part about being an editor is kind of removing your ego from it of, this might not be the story I wanted to tell, or this might not be the story that would interest me, but how do I make it the best version of that?
Yeah, and like how does it like make it the version that best fits what this project is trying to do, I guess. But would you say that like when I think about what an editor does, it's like, you're casting books, you're finding the right fit creatively, it's schedule management, giving feedback, providing a soundboard, doing all these different things. But would you say like a decent part of the job just kind of comes down to like in a very broad way of saying like problem solving almost?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And that's also, I think, part of the thrill for people who kind of stick around in this job is like I think we like helping other people solve
Mm-hmm.
problems.
Yeah.
Like even in the office, editors are popping into each other's offices being, oh, I heard you're looking for this colorist, or I heard you're looking for an artist for this book, or there's this writer I've been talking to, I don't have anything for. Maybe they'd be great for X. You become a cheerleader for kind of every element of your team, and you really like try to help either find them more work or find them the sort of best platform for their voice, or help other editors here kind of solve a solution. It's really neat.
Yeah, that is cool. I am kind of curious. One thing that like is when you work in single issue comics, like one of the things that's constantly around is like you have the diamond order cycle to contend with. And for listeners that don't know, comics are ordered over 3-month windows. So typically, number one is solicited 3 months out, and by the time number one is out, number four is in solicits. I'm curious, like how does that order cycle does it kind of create your order of operations for how you approach the job in a way?
Oh, it absolutely does. And it's so hard to shift from that cycle into OGNs. If you come up in the direct market and you try to shift to a mass market approach, which works more on a 2-year cycle, it's interesting because a big part about being an editor is knowing when to panic. And you want to sort of set your panic button early enough for you to be able to solve the problem. A lot of editors like, just, if you're going to be late, totally understand. Just give me the time you can hit because I can schedule around that and I can prep the team around that. Being late is something we take into account for good or for ill. It's just we need to know when so we can plan around it. But if your panic button is tied to the direct market versus mass market, that's actually too late.
Mm-hmm.
3 months out is too late than 2 years out. And so a lot of publishers are experiencing sort of that shift from, the direct market to the mass market with the graphic novel approach. And it's been a learning curve for me. It's been interesting.
I imagine Wild's End was kind of an interesting one because like the first two volumes were single issue miniseries, and then the third volume was released as a graphic novel. And it was funny because like we're going to talk about this more. I'm like probably the world's biggest super fan of Wild's End, I like to say.
It's my favorite thing in the world.
It's so good. It's incredible. I want to like force it into everyone's hands, but
it's your terror.
It is my terror, exactly. But that book, I mean, like it was announced. Journey's End, the final volume, was announced, I think, in January, and it was released in July. And that's probably a product of that mass market you're talking about. Versus, so like that probably shifts your cycle completely, I imagine.
Yeah, and the nice thing about Wild's End is we were able to sort of put it on the schedule when we knew we could, when we knew it would be done. Mm-hmm. So we kind of worked with the team to figure out how it fits into their schedule because Wild's End Volume 3 is a passion project. Mm-hmm. The single issues did not set the world on fire. Unfortunately, people aren't really into sad animals drinking tea, unlike us cultured folk.
I'm extremely into that. That is my very specific niche.
It is so my specific niche as well. And so, me and Cam, who were the editors on the book, we were the sort of like obnoxious cheerleaders of like, sure, like they all will discover it and trade, but isn't it great that they love it when they do? Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, it's a single issue and it has to make money for the retailer because the biggest thing, it's the retailers buy it and they can't return it. Mm-hmm. That's the other thing about the diamond system. And that's the other thing about the direct market is retailers are conservative in part because they can't return the stuff they don't sell. And these are independent businesses on budgets that shift month to month. And as a publisher, it's your responsibility to make sure they don't regret buying it from you. Mm-hmm. And so we had to find for the third volume a way to make the numbers make sense, but also let us finish the story. Mm-hmm. And the OGN was the way to go. Because in the mass market, those books are returnable. And so it's a different like the metrics and the financials are different. But we knew, we needed to finish this story. We just knew with every fiber of our being that like this wasn't the end. And so, we worked with the creators, and we worked with Boom, and we found a way to make it work. But it's because they own it, and we can find a way of fitting it into a schedule that makes sense for them.
Mm-hmm. I would have been so sad if it finished in the second volume. I mean, honestly, like I loved the ending. Like I thought the ending was tremendous, and in got Enemy Within, and but at the same time, it would have made me very sad. But I'm kind of curious. Like while we're on Wild's End, I might as well ask this.
Yeah.
Like, okay, so for listeners that don't know, just quick hype. It's not just about sad animals eating tea. It's or drinking tea. It's about like a small countryside town or small town in the British countryside where anthropomorphic animals live. They all live all in the world. Are like there's aliens that are invading the place, that area, and what happens when that starts happening, and what the people do, and what the people of England do. I guess I presume it's England. I guess I don't know if it was specifically stated that it was England. Okay, it is.
Yeah.
It's by Dan Abnett and Ian Colbert. Or I always used to just say Inge. I'm like Inge.
I say Inge too.
But anyways, it's just an absolutely wonderful comic. But one thing I was curious about is like the final volume is a graphic novel. However, it is also split into chapters. Was that ever like a 50-50 choice? Did they approach it as single issues and it just kind of became, a graphic novel?
A volume paper was always a graphic novel. But I think by that point, the voice of the book was chaptered.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something with the first, this sounds silly, but with the first volume, we're like, we don't know if we're going to get a second volume. So, we should have a real ending. And Dan's like, yeah. And I was like, you wanted more. And then volume 2, we're like, we don't know if we're going to get a third volume. So we should have like a more solid ending. And then he's like, yeah. And bless his heart for having faith in the story and in the audience, because I'm with you. Like, it needs a third volume, and it feels, reading it all together is and watching that arc is really something. But because the pacing and the voice of the book started in single issues, kind of carrying that through into the third volume, it just felt right. We wanted this to feel like a culmination and kind of changing. It's this sounds silly, but I liken it to Farscape. When Farscape got the 4-episode like mini series to cap everything off, you actually lost a lot of the emotional nuance because the pacing was different. It had to stay broad to cover more ground. And granted, you could argue, well, it's the same number of pages. You could pace it the same way. You could, but if the story isn't flowing within the same restrictions as the previous 2 chapters, that changes the narrative, whether you realize it or not. Mm-hmm. It's why stories are different in single issue than they are in graphic novel.
Yeah. My comparison was going to be far worse. I was going to, I'm a YA novel mark, and I don't know if you ever read the Divergent series, but the Divergent series, like the first 2 books were told from the perspective of one person, and the third book introduced a second narrator, and it like totally destroyed the book, and they had to do it, but at the same time, it was just like such a weird thing to introduce in the third one, and it just made the whole thing extremely like uncomfortable and weird. And it kind of made you hate both characters, which was not a good thing to do. But it's like you do kind of have to have that consistency. But one thing I do want to say, the last thing I'm going to say about Wild's End, is that that book was such a rare thing because it felt so, I don't even know how to phrase it. It just felt so cohesive and whole in a way that a lot of comics don't, because like the back matter, like the stuff that's put in there from like the reports from like the Private Hawk side and things like that, or like the journal entries from the varying characters, and then like the design. Like I actually talked to Kara Leopard, who worked with, was it Scott Newman on the design of the original logo, and like the I don't remember who did the design for Journey's End, but like the design work throughout just fit it so well, and it was this holistic package that
was Kara.
Was it Kara?
Yeah, so Kara was the designer of the first 2 volumes, and then they left. They weren't at Boom for like a year, maybe 2, and then they came back. And the moment they came back, me and Cam like ran to their office and was like, "Guess what? Since you're back, we're doing Wild's End had already been greenlit, but we were so excited that we kind of had our whole, like, it really was like the whole team back together.
Yeah. It's kind of like what you were saying with the Image books. It felt like, it really did feel like a holistic package in a way that few comics do, and I loved it. I mean, I thought that was a great thing of it.
Well, and that was something that Dan wanted from the very beginning, and his wonderful wife Nick writes a lot of that back matter material, and it helped fill out the world, and that was stuff that I loved in like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and kind of all my favorite comics was this sense of this like world existing outside of the page and outside of the story. I love found material, and so that we got to do that as well was so cool.
So I do want to say one of the things I think is really interesting about your like plate of books you deal with is the fact it's really, you're kind of all over the place. Like you deal heavily with both licensed comics and creator owned, which are, I don't know, I mean, kind of polar opposites in the comic creation spectrum in some ways. But was that just the way that the gig shook out, or was that set up something that fit your mentality and approach particularly well?
I mean, I think that's a little column A, a little column B. I mean, we were a small company, so it's not like we had a department for license and not license.
Sure.
But I think also, and we treat our licenses the same way we treat our originals. We don't, we carry the same passion, and we want to bring the same kind of art. Like we don't put ourselves like, this is an artist for licensed comics and this is an artist for originals. It's the same pool. Same thing with writers. And I also, I come from we were talking earlier about comic stories being off-putting. I was reading, DC Comics regularly, but I didn't feel comfortable talking about it with other people in real life. And I found a community online, and fandom was a space where I learned to be creative, and I learned to give critique, and I learned to give notes, and I learned to give feedback, and discovered fan art and fanfic. And so I come from my creativity was I learned the language and the vocabulary in what's ostensibly licensed, right? It's characters that don't belong to you, that follow, that are at the whims of an external creative force. And part of the skills that kind of forces you to adapt is, well, how do you write a character in the voice that other people recognize as the voice?
Right.
Right? How do you find that common vocabulary that reads as in character versus out of character? What are the things that you can change, and what are the things you can't change to keep it feeling like the same thing this stranger also loves? And so I do think that I had a particular set of skills, or at least taste, where I didn't look at licenses as lesser than.
Right.
I looked at it as a creative field and a creative challenge in and of itself. I really love trying to find what's in character and what's not of anything.
So would you say that largely there was little difference for you besides the fact on licensed books you obviously have to deal with like the licensing partners that you're dealing with?
Yeah, and I even enjoy that challenge, honestly. I like kind of finding what they're comfortable with and what they're open to, and seeing how far we can push things, and what nooks and crannies of characters and emotions I can explore. And I know that maybe some people find licenses restricting, and maybe they find that hard to sort of like, well, I can't do anything, so why should I do nothing? But I actually really think restrictions, both for licenses and original, make a better story. I think it forces you, it sounds so silly, and I've said it before, it's like a tweet, like a character limit, right? It forces you to really figure out what you actually want to say and not what you think you want to say. And so I view that about a page count. It's why I like single issues. 20 to 22 pages is a hard space to tell a complete, satisfying story that'll last you a month, but that challenge can really force you to find what matters. I like that about the character limit in a balloon. I like that about the space on a page. And I like that about licenses so you're not going to be able to decapitate a character.
Right.
Is decapitation what you're really into, or is it the emotion decapitation renders?
Right.
So it's that stuff. I really just, I like a good challenge, I guess.
Yeah. No. I mean, I've heard that from a lot of creators, is like having restrictions can be it can improve the story quality. I mean, it's like, this is an imperfect comparison, but it's just like, I often find that when you go to a restaurant that has like infinity options, it means you're going to probably get bad food. But if you go to a place that has like a curated menu, you're going to be much happier with the experience. And it's like,
Oh, absolutely.
it's really tough. If you have literally everything to choose from, it's going to be hard to work. But I like your suggestion that it's like, if you can get these like core ideas right, the whole thing will work. It's like you did Sleepy Hollow, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you can get Ichabod Crane right, then that whole thing is going to work, because Ichabod Crane was the heart and soul of that. But anyways, I do want to point out that I heard that apparently you were basically just sitting around watching Sleepy Hollow when you're like, why isn't this a comic? And then you decided to make that a comic. That's amazing.
Well, and God bless the Fox folks, Josh Izzo, who is there. I think now he's moved on, but like I was like, hey, anyone got the Sleepy Hollow license? He's like, no, like it just started. Like, why, huh? And I was like, he's tall and she's short, and that's cute. Let me do something with it. I came from X-Files, right? And so I was already watching it with some friends kind of weekly, and there's a lot of like fun pulpy material there, and it's very like, I don't know if you remember that first season, kind of went a little off the rails later, but that first season was like such a wacky idea that they executed, because they just embraced the concept whole cloth.
Yeah.
And it was stylish. Like, it was actually a really beautiful show. It really played with color in an interesting way, and it really kind of lent itself to the medium of comics. And, I just got really lucky to work with wonderful people. It's how I got to work with Marguerite Bennett for the first time. It's how I got to work with Tamara Bonvillain, who's one of the freaking
incredible
best colorists in the biz. It's how I got to work with Jorge Coelho, who, like, he's got this like beautiful like woodworky style. Victor Santos did the second arc, and like he's got a completely different style that still feels really in line. I met Eric Carrasco, who is a writer on Supergirl now, and he was the writer's assistant for Sleepy Hollow, and he was writing the approvals on the first volume. And like, I met him, I think, at a holiday party, and we just totally hit it off. We have the same kind of tastes in, Le Carre novels and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and all that period shit I'm into. And got to work with him on his first comic with Sleepy Hollow. So it was just for something that, flash in a pan is the wrong word, but didn't really last that long. It provided such fertile material for new creators to get their start.
Yeah.
It was really cool.
Yeah, that is awesome. I just have a couple more questions before we get into 5 questions about you. But I did want to ask about casting, because, like, I want to use a very specific example. For listeners that don't know, casting is like the process of effectively finding the right creators for certain projects. I know some editors don't really love that term, but it's kind of a good blanket term. But so let's use something like Kong on the Planet of the Apes, which is a very specific hybrid project of 2 different licenses, which I imagine, like, you probably need somebody that's like very specifically knowledgeable about this stuff in some ways. But so Ryan Ferrier's writing it, Carlos Magno on art, and Mike Huddleston on covers. Like, when you have that idea in hand, how do you start putting the team together on that?
Oh man, that's such a great example of like Ross, who runs the company, comes to my office like, well, if you could cross over anything, like, what would it be? And I was like, well, I mean, we got 2 8 books, guys. Like, it's right there. I don't know what to tell you. Like, I'm a very literal person. We've established this from the beginning. And also, like, the idea of the Kong world we were playing with, we were very specifically Skull Island and Planet of the Apes, has the Forbidden Zone. And so you've got that sort of element of a hidden community of hyper smart humans, which fits very in line with Kong Island being like, maybe maybe the island's been isolated from what's been happening to the rest of the Planet of the Apes. And what would Kong look like to apes, and what would apes look like to the people of Skull Island? And so once we kind of had that kind of idea percolating, Ryan is someone who I worked with on a lot. I mean, he does the backup stories for our Power Rangers books, and his brain is a machine. I worked with him on Sons of Anarchy, I think was the first book I ever worked with him on, and he was just amazing to work with. I worked with him on something else after that. God, I've been in comics too long. But I really like working with him. I really wanted to keep working with him. And I knew that he's someone who could really hit this sort of pulpy. I love his original. I don't know if you like Wild Zen, you should really check out Kennel Block Blues. I did not work on it, so I can recommend it. purely as a fan. It's Oz meets Wild's End meets a musical. And
I
when I
actually
say
have that.
Oz, I mean HBO, the prison
Oh,
drama
I
Oz.
know. Yeah, no, I actually I have that in trade. I haven't read it yet. I love Dave. Like, I really love his
Uh-huh.
book Dave. Like, that's a really good one. And anyways, I've actually met him a bunch of times because I know he used to be a letterer actually,
Yeah.
which is a very comic book story to have. But anyway, sorry, continue.
Well, and so I knew I wanted to work with him on this, and I reached out to him, and that's when he told me, he's like, "Did you not know I was like the biggest Planet of the Apes fan?" I was like, I honestly, I didn't. I'm so sorry I reached out to you because I just think you're a great writer. He's like, oh wow, well yeah, I totally love this, and he came back with an idea that was exactly spot on what we were looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And working with someone like Ryan and that sort of enthusiasm and his knowledge of the Planet of the Apes franchise and Kong, like he really got to the heart of it, which is, you know, this idea of ape supremacies used sort of in the way that in our current politics, like American exceptionalism is,
Mm.
and that any facts that threaten that, what Zaya serves as, it's not that he doesn't deny the reality. It's just the reality is a political threat to the social order.
Mm-hmm.
And Zayas is basically Bannon. He's the Steve Bannon of the Planet of the Apes universe. And so he's not someone who is stupid. And he is not someone who is naive. He's just someone who is more cynical than he has faith in anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And having that character kind of face the unexplainable in Kong, who is physically this seemingly brute force example of apes' dominance over man, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
these natives worship him, but you can't communicate with Kong. It doesn't have language. He doesn't have culture. And so it becomes a mockery of everything apes believe in.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the most powerful creature on earth, but we can't form a sentence. And so Ursus, of course, who is someone who views brute strength as might makes right, would look at Kong as this example of course we're dominant. But Zaius recognizes the existential threat Kong poses, which is, yes, the natives worship Kong, but Kong needs them as much as they need him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not something that kind of heresy is not something that can come back to ape society, which is already on the brink with, Talking Taylor. It's already on the, you see in the second movie, young apes protesting, which was very much a product of the time the movie was made, but is also an example of what Zaius is facing against.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ryan really kind of honed in on the politics of both of these franchises and then got Ursus onto a dinosaur shooting guns. It's what I love about comics. You can have all these kind of like deep thoughts, and then you can have an ape on a dinosaur double fisting machine guns. It's great.
Yeah.
It's awesome. And then Carlos Magno, who drew, Planet of the Apes for 2 years and drew Kong for a year. Like,
Perfect
come
fit.
on. Perfect fit. The guy's amazing. I don't know if you've read his Daryl Gregory Planet of the Apes books.
I have not.
You have to. I did not start on that book, so I can say it's one of the best Planet of the Apes. I did finish it, but I didn't launch the book and I didn't put that team together. I came on, I think, around issue 4, and it went for 16 issues, and then we had 3 specials, and it's Planet of the Apes meets Game of Thrones. You really should check it out.
One thing I thought was really interesting that I came across when I was like researching this was like you actually weren't an ape. You'd never engaged with apes before you got onto the apes books, right?
Yeah. I fell in love.
Well, honestly, like the funny thing is like my introduction, this is horrible, was the Mark Wahlberg movie. But then like I actually really,
Same.
I love the James Franco, like the series that becomes like the Andy Serkis one. And that led me to go back to the original ones. And those are also very enjoyable. And it is really funny how that stuff happens. But the last question I have for you, this is kind of an oddball, not how I intended to finish, but what happens, like your enthusiasm for apes is obvious as you're talking, but what would happen if something was given to you that you weren't enthusiastic about? Is that something where it would just be handed off to somebody else, or is that you would just kind of figure it out, or what happens in that situation?
Honestly, I think I can find a way to make myself enthusiastic, and maybe that just means I'm easy. I do think if I can find a story I don't think there are many bad stories. I do think, I mean, I don't want to say there aren't any bad stories, because I do think there are some sort of like, I think Nazis have plenty of bad stories, right? Like,
Right.
I think a lot of like, white supremacist art just isn't good art.
Right.
But I do think that I think a great example of this is, I'm going to be truly myself in this moment, something like Kingsman, which I was not excited to see. And I thought, I didn't like Wanted. I don't like this type of story. Like, cool. It's a white kid finding out he's the most special kid in the entire universe, and he gets everything that he wants, and the girl and the gun and the cars. But that movie executed the premise well.
Mm-hmm.
It executed the characters well. It realized the characters have a point of view and want something and have stakes. And so if there is a story that on the face of it, I'll be like, well, I just think it's XYZ. Okay, well, it's my job to make it ABC.
Yeah.
That's my job. My job is to find the beating heart of something I might not immediately spark to. And I can usually get myself there. Rangers is not I was going to say Rangers is a good example, but I didn't grow up on Rangers. That wasn't, that my brother did, but I kind of missed that boat entirely. And I fell in love. I fell in love working on the book. I realized it was a team full of Robins, and I was on board, right? I was like, oh, this one's Tim, and this is Tim 2, and this is Tim 3. But I also like found a way to connect with it that I didn't expect, and got excited about it.
Mm-hmm.
And now I won't shut up about, Trini, and I don't want to spoil it. Never mind. Something cool's coming up with Trini.
I think one thing that you could compare it to is just like, I love Ratatouille, and I always love the idea of like anybody can cook. But I mean, really, it's like that idea done, or, translated onto stories would be basically like any story could be good. And it's like, if you can find the right story to tell within any certain universe, you can probably, like, it can be done. It's not like, I mean, honestly, like, Manos Hands of Fate is an astonishingly terrible movie, but I mean, maybe something interesting could be done with the concept if the right person got their hands on it. Or like Sleepaway Camp. Actually, some people yell at me for saying Sleepaway Camp's bad.
Can I be really literal again?
Sure.
Like, let's look at Civil War and Batman versus Superman.
Yeah.
It's the same movie.
Right.
It's the same stakes. It's, okay, Steve's best friend murdered Tony's mom. Like, it's like the Martha. It's a little more murdery, but it's kind of the same story. It's just one was done with character in mind, and one was done with punching in mind.
Right.
And so
do you
there's
bleed?
Not do you bleed? Like, you can have that moment happens when Cap's about to stab Tony in the heart with his shield.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's there. And I say this as someone who grew up on DC, and I don't want to give any, I can't believe I'm a Marvel person now, but at least in the films, they remember its character first. It's not the fights.
Yeah, you're 100% right about that. I mean, it is. I honestly think that my wife is actually very deeply fascinated by how like Marvel can get this stuff so right, but DC can't. But I really do think you're right. It really does come down to character and like just like the story approach and like what they're building the character or stories off of. This is an entirely different tangent. We have to go into a different tangent before we go because I gotta let you go. We're gonna close with 5 questions about you, Dafna Pleban, the person. So we have to start with your true passion in life currently, which is the terror.
The terror.
I just like I haven't watched it, so don't yell at me. But we don't have AMC in Alaska; they got rid of it, so I'm waiting for it to come on like something else I can watch. But so a show, it's a show whose first season was an adaptation of a novel of the same name that followed a fictionalized account of Captain Sir John Franklin's lost expedition to the Arctic. Has an amazing cast, which you have noted many times on Twitter, which I love. So this is a 2-for-1 question. What is it you love so much about this show, and has there been anyone in the Boom offices that you haven't been able to convert to your terror club?
Well, I got Bryce finally. So Bryce finally cracked. I think Cameron, my co-editor on Wild's End, is my next target.
Oh, you should get him. He's probably depressed after the Cavs lost LeBron James anyway, so he probably needs the support.
I don't know what any of that sentence means. I could not tell you what you just told me, but I could tell you that Cornelius Hickey's knife was found actually in the ice. And that's a terror thing. Don't worry about it. But, God, so the first question is, what do I like about it?
What is it that you love so much about the show?
Geez, where do I start? I mean, I think the core of it, it was that, look, I knew I was going to love the show. I knew I was going to watch the show when the images for the promo came out. And it's these sort of really stark studio shot images of the characters kind of posed in slightly kind of artificial manner that really invokes the kind of classic portraiture of the time. And I was like, this is striking. This is a weird way of like advertising your show. This is odd. I love it. I like this cast, but it's probably going to be just boring period stuff. And, you know, they're going to talk about like knots and ship stuff. And I'll just let them talk and look pretty and play Overwatch while I watch. But, you know, I'm glad this exists, but I'm not really going to get into it. But I knew that I was going to watch it sort of for like the costume porn and all this stuff. But I wasn't really interested. My tastes don't really run into the, I don't want to watch people die.
Yeah, it's like Master and Commander with more death.
Yeah, well, it felt like Master Commander meets Walking Dead, right? They all die. We know how this ends. These are real people. I read the Wikipedia. They don't come back. So I'm going to commit my emotional energy to watching people die, which, again, I don't mind death and I don't mind drama. I really love drama and I really love trauma, like in storytelling. But there's a nihilism that's kind of sweeping a lot of narratives right now of like, you know, when push comes to shove, man will turn on each other. We're all inherently selfish creatures who, you know, in the middle of an apocalypse, like, we're going to kill you. Like, The Purge is happening, right? And Walking Dead and like, all these stories of wouldn't you want to kill your fellow man?
Right.
And I read the history and it's about cannibalism and it's a horror genre. And I'm like, okay, so this is going to be about like people who like each other being put into position of having to eat each other. And that can't possibly, like, I'm not in the mood for that right now. I'm already seeing sort of man's inhumanity to man in real life. I don't think I can kind of willingly submit myself to that now. But a funny thing happened when I watched the show. Yes, they all die. Yes, they resort to cannibalism. It is not about man's inhumanity to man. And it's not about these characters discovering that. And same thing happens in Planet of the Apes. Even though humans and apes like are an existential threat to each other, right? You have in the first movie, you know, the presence of humans, you know, and how the humans destroyed each other's aces. Like we can't afford to know what you know because you killed yourself. It made you suicidal. And I believe in my society and I believe we need to go on. So shut the fuck up or I'll shut you up. But Zaius and Taylor do come to an understanding of each other as people. Same thing with the Terror, which is, yes, resources are limited to dwindling. People are going to be put into positions that are precarious, in which their personal safety versus someone's personal safety comes directly in conflict. The show puts these characters in positions in which selfishness could keep you alive a day longer. But what kind of life is that? If you are no longer the person, your best version of yourself? It's weirdly optimistic for still being, it's nihilistic, not cynical. And that's a very hard line to strike. And I like posted on my, you know, I kind of fall into that rabbit hole of listening to, after I finish something, what everyone is talking about, like the creators and what they think about their work and what they were trying to do in their work. And I came across some, you know, interviews of the showrunners, and they just described stuff. They just described their approach in such a succinct, articulate way of why they love these characters, and even though they all die, and even though they kill them off, they want them to be their best selves, even at their worst. And that is such a interesting approach. I really like, it's something I try to do in my work, and seeing people pull it off in a collaborative, creative field, and everyone firing on all cylinders, the writers, the actors, the production, the directing, everything. Everyone is on the same page and they're hitting the same note together. That's wild. It's a really cool. I get the same experience. I don't know if you ever watched The Americans.
I have not watched The Americans.
Well, The Americans is finished.
I know it
definitely watch it. It was my terror before the terror. Really obnoxious about The Americans. And they also, both actually shows had podcasts with the showrunners kind of recapping the episodes. And The Americans podcast was run by the showrunners, and they had the studio exec, the person that in all of these narratives we always hear like is the person giving shitty notes and, telling them to make things more marketable, and they don't understand story. And they had their studio exec on, and the studio exec and they were on the same page as to what the story was.
Mm-hmm.
And they worked together to craft the same kind of story together. And listening to a happy collaborative environment is I guess for editors like our porn. It's just like it's really fun to hear.
See, this is what I really appreciate about your Twitter, and also just your perspective is like, it's weird that you said that like marketing didn't work for you, because I feel like it's now an imperative that I should watch The Terror and The Americans, which is pretty hilarious. Well, all right, let's move on to the next subject though. You mentioned Overwatch. I want to bring up Overwatch. You're an Overwatch player. I'm an Overwatch player. It's a game that I absolutely love most of the time and absolutely loathe at other times. What's the best and worst parts about Overwatch for you?
I am terrible at aiming, and I play in console. So the best part of Overwatch is that I play Torbjorn and Junkrat, which you don't need to be good at things.
Yes.
And I'm great at being bad. I also don't mind dying, so that's super helpful.
That's actually important in Overwatch, I think.
Yeah, like if I mind dying, like that would be a problem, right? Like that would be if you're not good, you're gonna die a lot. The thing that I don't like about Overwatch, is those cutscenes and the character work they do there is so good. I wish there was a story mode.
Oh, I know.
I love it in the anniversary events where you get to play story
and
get to hear the characters interact. And so the very medium of the game that makes it so addicting, which is the sort of like quick in and out, like you play 10, 20 minutes, and then you can be done. So it's not a huge time commitment, is also the thing that's like, well, but I want more. Like I want to experience this more. I played a lot of MMOs in college. Well, I played one MMO. I played World of Warcraft. And so it's like, I want to be able to play with other people, but also play a narrative.
Yeah.
So I kind of wish Overwatch was an MMO, which is what it started as before they converted it into a shooting game.
I'm glad it is what it is, but I do say like one thing that I grew up playing single player games. Like that was what I was all about. And like single player games are just kind of secondary these days, and I do wish that I remember I picked up Overwatch, or I picked up Star Wars Battlefront, and then I picked up Overwatch shortly thereafter, and both games I was just like, man, I really wish there was like a single player narrative to this, because it would really enhance the game quite a bit. But it is funny though, because like I know Overwatch has its like lore, because I've heard people like sarcastically reference it, and I've not like watched any of the animated shorts or anything like that, and I really should, because I hear really good things about them. But I don't know, I totally agree with you on both points. All right, so we have to talk about Kingsman. We have to make this quick. We're both fans of the first Kingsman movie, which is not as universally beloved as The Terror or Overwatch.
Should be.
I would say it's the thing I most associated with you on Twitter before The Terror came along. So
I'm so sorry.
Give me a minute on why you believe the first Kingsman is good.
I think it's a perfect pop song. I think it as a piece of pop culture, I think it's just as long as it needs to be. I think it's structurally perfect, except for that last joke. Mm-hmm. And that last joke is bad because it actually betrays what the rest of the movie does so well.
Sure.
But what I love about that is it has a perfect character introduction to Eggsy.
Mm-hmm.
The first 5 minutes you meet him, every part of himself, every like key characteristics of his character is revealed in his interactions with others, and is supported by how he passes or fails the Kingsman test. And that's a really clean way of both introducing you to a character and kind of setting you up of why this character is actually not going to be successful in this Kingsman test. You meet him as he, snipes back at his father. He loves his little sister. He goes out with his friends. He's loyal to his friends. He doesn't rat them out. He steals the keys. He's a good driver. He doesn't kill the fox. You know what you're going to know when he's offered the gun and told to kill this dog and he can become a Kingsman. He's not going to pull the trigger. He's not going to do it. You told me that the first second I met him. You introduced this character to me, and you told me he's not going to rat out his friends and he's not going to hurt a defenseless animal. And you have supported it in this very sort of literal representation of character device of the Kingsman test. That's elegant. Like, just from a structural point of view, it's pure. Like, I adore that. Just from a writing point of view. And then the other thing is Eggsy is not a traditional main male character. He's not looking to get laid until the end, and we don't talk about. That's why that joke doesn't work. But when he meets Roxy, he doesn't hit on her.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't ever try to hit on her. He becomes her best friend. He supports her. And he's motivated by his sister and his mom. He's not motivated by getting laid. And that's why that joke actually doesn't work, is because 2 seconds before you have him call Roxy and say, can you please tell my mom to put my sister in the bathroom?
Right.
And protect her. You already showed me the stakes. You did not need to go from a purely structural plot point of view. You did not need to give me a second thing for him to want. You've given me the prime thing for him to want.
Mm-hmm.
It's inelegant. Like, I can take a shitty joke. Like, that's fine. It's just not a good one. And it's not worth throwing away the character that you've actually meticulously set up.
Yeah.
I've read a lot of explanations by this from Matthew Vaughn, and he's like, well, it's taking the Bond thing and turning it to 11. It's subverting the Bond genre. I was like, you subverted the Bond genre by making him a nice guy who respects his mom and loves his sister.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you subverted the Bond genre by giving him stakes in the world, by not making him a nihilist. Like, congrats, you already did that. You didn't have to do it by an anal joke.
Mm-hmm.
Just lazy.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I totally agree with all the other things you said about Kingsman. I do want to say that, like, that was actually another spy movie that was super underrated from about the same time period was The Man from U.N.C.L.E.
Man from U.N.C.L.E.
Oh my God. Like that, like seriously, like I think
so good.
I think the scene where Henry Cavill is in like the truck eating a sandwich and listening to music.
It's so perfect.
It's like the greatest. It's one of my favorite scenes, like randomly ever in movies. I just love watching it. It just has such a good feel to it. It's like, it is funny because it's Matthew Vaughn and Guy Ritchie, who are like bros, but.
Well, and what's wild is, I saw King Arthur later, and I was like, how did this person also make Man from U.N.C.L.E.? Like, it is, Man from U.N.C.L.E., I think, is another one of those movies like Kingsman that I think is like perfectly structured.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's as clean or as elegant as Kingsman. I think Kingsman has this very traditional, it's like a really well done watch, right? It's not complicated. There's no tricks. It doesn't do anything new. It just does this thing that you've seen before so well it feels new.
Mm-hmm.
Man from U.N.C.L.E. feels like you're watching a miniseries in 2 hours. It doesn't feel long, it doesn't drag, but it feels like you've been with these characters on a mission for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And those, God, like, I still think about, the scene where you find out that Ilya, like, is really good with fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not played as, oh, isn't it crazy this, like, tall masculine guy is, like, really into belts. No, it's played as, of course he would be this particular about how you look. Like,
right.
He's someone who's a control freak. That makes sense.
Yeah, I love that movie. It's very stylish, and and also, like, I don't know. I thought Cavill and actually
it's so good.
The whole cast
so
is really
good,
but he is really good. He's such a good rogue in it. But all right. So next question. You're also a fellow cat owner. I have an 8-month-old kitten, as we talked about beforehand. He's my first cat. He oscillates between being the sweetest creature on the earth and being an absolute terror. What's the one piece of advice about the cat life you'd give me as he approaches his first birthday?
Give up. Honestly, like, I just gave up. Like, so there's cat hair everywhere. That's fine. It's my baby. I'm proud. Yeah, I got no advice other than cats are amazing, and I'm so happy for you. Your life is perfect now.
I would say our biggest problem is the fact our cat is a massive foodie, and he just like is very pretentious about what he eats. He's like, "Oh, that's not locally sourced. How dare you? I hate you."
When do you feed him?
We've been kind of, we do first thing in the morning, and then we do 2 feedings at night. But we were thinking, we've kind of talked about switching to like 2 feedings a day, and he's just like, I don't know, he kind of just seems used to his routine at this point. He just gets kind of picky sometimes.
I would suggest an automatic feeder so he disassociates you with food, so he doesn't annoy you, and feeding at night so he like gets full in his belly and passes out and doesn't wake you up in the morning being like, I'm hungry again.
Yeah, that's good advice.
It's like a toddler. Just tucker him out.
All right, last question, and perhaps the most important of all of them. Your Twitter @ is Dafna Doom. Why is it Dafna Doom? Is it just because it sounds cool? Because it does sound cool.
It used to say Dafna Boom, but I didn't want people to think that I was only like a boom marketing account.
Sure.
And I changed it to Dafna Doom for Halloween because everyone was doing their sort of like, like their Halloween Twitter name. And I also just feel like that's probably what people feel like when they realize I'm into something, because I'll be coming by their office being like, "Have you heard about X? Do you want to see it?"
It's a very good contrast with your Twitter avatar.
And that was drawn by she used to be a graphic designer here, and now she's in animation. Cassandra Heller. She drew it in a meeting, like in a editorial meeting one day, and I've co-opted it as my identity ever since.
Oh, it's a very lovely piece. I mean, it's like it definitely has that animation quality to it.
She's amazing. You should check out her stuff. Her art's stunning.
I would love to, but Dafna, that's all I have. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about your job, the world of comics, Kingsman, The Terror, everything.
Thank you for having me. This was awesome.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with Boom editor Dafna Pleban. You can find Dafna on Twitter at DafnaDoom, on Tumblr at Dafnap, at tumblr.com, and her work in variant titles at Boom Studios. If you're a fan of the show, check it out on Patreon. If you back it on there, you not only support the show, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to exclusive written and audio content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find it on social media as well. Like the show on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD, follow on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or follow me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Phil White, Ben Becker, Sean Pinella, Kent Heidelman, Philip Sevi, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Paletto, Dylan Campbell, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Michael Garland, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Assey, Mike Gillis, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Maria Schweitzer, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Dan Guarino, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Evan Blazer, Brian McRae, Ira James Udaskin, Henning Allers, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bruno Batista, Abraham Reisman, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, Darren Neely, John Hendrick, Steve Anderson, Phil Nall, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Chipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Nicholas Kesslake, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mail, Adam Highfield, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DeMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. Quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from the album Volmilch opens and closes the show. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.